Today on the bench, I have an Ingersoll-Rand 2235TiMax half-inch air impact. The customer said that the gasket between the hammer housing and the body is pinched, and he said it leaks, and as a result, he has low power. So we're going to take this apart. I'll show you step by step how to do that. We're going to inspect everything, and I'll show you exactly what to look for, and then we'll clean it, inspect it, see if we need to buy any parts for it, and then reassemble it once any new parts that we need have arrived. Now, if you noticed, I'm not wearing disposable nitrile gloves to protect my hands from dirt. Why? Because I don't mind cleaning up with Coyle Tools Man Cleaner. It's a heavy pumice scrubbing soap formulated specifically for mechanics and even gardeners. After you get your hands all full of grease, dirt, oil, and grime, you can use this pumice soap to scrub it away. It exfoliates and digs deep to get out even the deepest set dirt in your hands. Use it on your hands, elbows, knees, and other hard spots. Don't use it on the rest of your body. For that, we have Parts Cleaner, which is a bath and body soap and is perfect for everyday use. All natural, handmade. I make it myself in my kitchen with only a few ingredients. It washes away clean, doesn't leave a residue, and will not dry out your skin. You can buy it for $5 per bar, or buy 5 bars, get one free. For ordering information, email me at sales@coiletools.com. First step is to remove the 4 body screws here, and these screws go all the way through the body into the hammer housing where they hold everything together. So when we remove these, keep everything on a horizontal surface because we're going to separate these 2 pieces and we don't want anything to fall out. To remove those screws requires a T25 torque screw. The first thing we'll inspect is the gasket that got pinched. And it's not a bad idea to replace these gaskets as a matter of course, only because they are a wear item and over time they'll compress and lose their resiliency. It doesn't look bad, but we'll keep looking through here and see what else we can find. I also look right away in the hammer housing here to see what the state of the lubricant is and if there's any wear. Now, the lubricant here is old, dry, and gritty. That's typical because I haven't met a mechanic yet who routinely maintains air tools. You can add grease through the zerk in the bottom, but most don't, and you can see just how gritty and dry the lubricant is. But it doesn't look like there's any excessive wear on the inside of the housing here, which you do see sometimes. Where you're going to want to look for wear mostly is on the hammer assembly here. So these 2 pieces here are the hammers. This is the hammer cage that it resides in, and this is the anvil. Everything's held together by 2 pins here and here. First thing to do is remove the anvil by twisting it and working it past the hammers. And that comes out. And again, there's old dried lubricant on the anvil. Turn the cage on end and push out the 2 pins, and then just lift the cage off the hammers. Inspect the inside of the hammer cage to see if there's any wear there. Those surfaces look pretty good. I also look at the spline drive to see if any splines are worn, but the teeth on there also look good. The hammers themselves don't show any signs of wear, so I'm getting optimistic that everything is as it should be. You hardly ever see wear in these pins, but you look at them anyway just to see if something's wrong with them. They look fine. Now we're left with the rotor assembly in the housing here. This whole assembly should just pop out, and it does. First thing to do here is to remove the selector switch just by pulling it straight off. You might need a pair of pliers, but this came right out. There's an O-ring there you want to inspect. And the entire assembly is held in place by a snap ring on the back of the spindle. So I remove that snap ring using a pair of snap ring pliers. Now be very careful not to lose this snap ring. It's a critical component, and replacing it would be a pain in the neck if you lose it. It's small, it's tiny, it could fly off your pliers, or you could put in a place where you might misplace it. I always put all my parts in a bag, and that bag was in a box, so it's very difficult for me to misplace anything. Now the snap ring's out, the rotor comes out when you pull this front cap off, like so. Oh, and there was a plate in there, and that plate came out. And now the rotor pulls right out. The rotor has 7 vanes in it, or blades. It's these plastic pieces, and they come right out. So let's pull those out and put them aside too. We'll inspect those for damage later, but right now we're going to look at the face of the rotor to see if there's any damage here. What happens a lot of times with these rotors, when people don't maintain these, an old lubricant can build up on these faces, and when it does, that causes a lot of friction, and that robs the tool of power. These feel pretty smooth, so I think the lubricant that's on there is still in pretty decent shape. So I don't think any damage has been done to the surface here. There is a slip fit bearing that goes in this plate. That's this guy right here. And usually it's a shielded bearing. I'm going to get past the grease on here to see. Yeah, such is the case here. I try to pop this out. I can't always do it, but if you look here, there is hopefully a gap between the bearing and where it sets on the shoulder of this plate. If you get lucky, you can get a pick in there and pop this bearing out. So I take a 90-degree pick and see if I can get it in there. Lucky for me, that came out real easy. Sometimes the fit on that is very tight, but this time it was a cinch to get out. There's also a bearing on the rear of the rotor sleeve, and that can also be difficult to take out sometimes, but we'll try it using the same method as the other bearing to see if we can get our pick in there. And we can. Just got to work that out. And we might have to push it from the back side because it's not giving up as easy as we'd like. There we go. Pops it right out. And that's that bearing. The sleeve itself looks pretty good. You rarely see any damage here, but always check the inside surface because that's what the rotor spins around. Next, we're going to take out the air inlet assembly, which is the piece that runs all the way up the handle and ends in this valve up here, and that's what directs the airflow. This pops out by depressing a spring retainer clip here and on the other side. Ingersoll does make a tool specifically for this, but I do it just fine with a pocket screwdriver. You push down on the ear and work it a little bit toward the end where you're going to get the top of the ear, going to cause it to get held up inside the handle, and then once it is, you just pull the whole thing out. Can be a little challenging to get it where it wants to be using this method, but it's worked every time for me so far. And sometimes you can hear it click where it snaps back into place. You just got to go back and do it again. And once you have both ears depressed, grab a pair of pliers and pull this out. There you go. This washer can stay right where it is. That's not going to be important to us for now. Just make sure that it's there and note it. Here is a spring clip that was holding everything in. You can see the ear here and the ear on the bottom. That's the two pieces that were popping up into that slot. And you got to depress those and kind of work it down a little bit to get it held up. So just pop this off the assembly. Here is your valve. Unless there's a problem with airflow, I would leave this right in place. It comes out by moving this spring, snap ring. So there's a snap ring, there's this valve here, and there's a valve seat around it and a spring in the bottom. It's not the easiest thing to put back together again, so unless there's a problem with airflow or the trigger sticks or something like that, I always leave this in place. Next, you just pull the trigger out. The trigger was being held in by the valve stem on the air inlet. And the way that looks like is this. You see the stem here. There's a hook on the end of the trigger, and that rests in there like that. So when this is in place, you can't pull the trigger out, and you depress, and when you depress the trigger, it moves the valve. So when you remove this, that frees up the trigger and the trigger slides out. Next, remove the direction buttons. They're held in with a tab that rests against this piece of plastic that divides the two buttons. Working with one button that's all the way up, just stick a screwdriver down in there and press this tab that's going to pop the thing out. And do the same on the other side. Two more things, and that is this gasket here along the back. That just slides out like so. And then the valve, which is right here. Push that down, and it pops out through the bottom of the handle. In a perfect world. There it is. And just give that a look to make sure everything's okay. There's a couple of hole rings on there. Inspect those. Inspect the little plastic pieces on the bottom. Make sure everything's intact. My initial impression is this tool is extremely clean. Usually you see a lot of dirt and buildup on the valve and on the rotor faces, but there's really nothing much to note there at all. I'd say that this tool is not heavily used. I'll put all the parts through the parts washer and get them all thoroughly cleaned to remove all the grease, oil, and dirt. But the tool's fairly clean already, so I'd be surprised if I found anything that I didn't already see just in disassembling it. But it gives me a chance to give every part a close, deep inspection and see if there's anything that I missed. So I'd be surprised if I didn't find that all this needs is a tune-up, which consists of some new gaskets and some new rotor vanes. Now that everything's been put through the parts cleaner, it's my chance to wipe everything down and give everything its final up-close inspection. New parts came in. I have the body gasket here as well as the rear gasket. My customer asked me to only replace those things. He did not want a complete tune-up on this, which would include replacing the rotor vanes and some of the O-rings. I don't disagree with that because this was in such good shape. I don't think that's going to be an issue for him for a while down the road. So we're going to reinstall everything else, but we're going to replace the pinch gasket, which was the red one there. And it's a good idea while you're replacing gaskets, throw a new one of these guys in here too. So the first thing we're going to do is reassemble the rotor housing. And this starts with the air inlet assembly. And the first piece of that is this valve. There's a tab on the valve here. This goes toward the rear of the assembly. And there's a couple of O-rings, so we're going to throw some lubricant on the O-rings first. And when you insert this, it goes up through the hole in the handle with the tab toward the rear. Drop it everywhere, because hanging on to it would be dumb. You're going to need something like a pocket screwdriver to get this all the way up, and you can tell it's all the way up when you look inside and see it poke through the hole on the top. And I just tap it a little bit because the last couple of millimeters are a little sensitive there. A little bit more. There we go. Now, this tab here in the back has to be aligned with this square piece. With this square piece behind it. The corner of that tab is going to line up with the corner of that square piece. And then when you hit the directional button, it's going to swivel this valve around, so that tab then lines up with the corner of the other side of that square piece. So this one's a little funky to get right, but once you understand how it works, it's not difficult. And when we do this, we're going to start by inserting the selector button on this side of the valve, so that when the gears mesh, it pushes it all the way in. This retainer tab goes up against this partition, and that's how you know you have it lined up correctly. And these can only go in one way. And then you have to depress the retainer tab with something like a pocket screwdriver to get that to set in properly. Once that's in there, just push it all the way down, and then use the other one, again with some lubrication on it. It goes in the other side. Depress that retainer tab. And push that in. Now, we can tell we're lined up properly when we push each of the buttons and it rotates that valve so that the corner of that tab lines up with the corner of that square piece. See that? It's perfect. That is correct. If it doesn't line up, you got it wrong, you got to try it again. And you just depress the buttons on either end. All right, next the air inlet assembly goes in through the hole in the handle. Valve stem goes up inside first, and this gets retained when we put the clip on it. This clip has the two ears here and here. That's got to go toward the hex bolster on the bottom of this, and this just clips into place between this shoulder and that shoulder, and just snaps right in there. So just push it on, you'll hear it click when you got it right. And you can see it sets nice and flush, just the way it should. When you insert this in the hole, you have to line up each of these ears with the cutouts on the handle. It does not matter 180 degrees which way that goes, but you can't put it in incorrectly. And put a touch of lubrication on the O-ring here. You'll know this goes in all the way when you hear it click, when the ears to the spring clip protrude into the slots on the handles. And listen carefully, you'll hear it. Just like that. And then double check it where you can see the ear in the slot there. Perfect. Next, the trigger goes in and drops some lubrication on the O-ring. This has a hook on it. That hook grabs onto the valve stem. So what happens when you put this in, push it all the way in, it's going to grab that valve stem, and now it springs back, but you can't pull it out because it grabbed on properly. That's how you know that's correct. And then we insert this new gasket. You can see how there's a piece that protrudes out here. There's a channel in there, and that slides into a piece in the back here that's made to accept that. It's difficult to show you on camera. You will see it when you try to do this yourself. It's obvious. This can only go in one way. So line the channel up there with the grooves in the back. And that just slides in the back there. You can tell you've got it correct when that piece is flush along the back and this piece is flush along the rearward surface. Let's push it in there real good to make sure you got it seated properly. The body's done. We're going to set this aside and do the rotor assembly. In the rear of this sleeve goes one of the shielded bearings. And that's just a slip fit bearing. It should not be too difficult to get in there, but we could hit some resistance, so we have to be careful to try to put this in evenly, and then it sets in all the way. So you can tell it's correct when it's flush with the rest of the housing there. You might have to tap that in, but if you do not hit that shield or you're going to wreck it. Use a socket that fits just over the race and then tap it in that way, but be careful. I would exhaust all other possibilities first. Try to push it in with your hands first if you can. Next, the rotor goes in with the spindle with the groove on it facing rearward because that goes through the bearing. And that sets in there like that. Now we take the snap ring and install it in that groove. You know it's correct when it's seated properly in its groove, and the way to do that is to press on a little bit just to make sure it's sat in there and test it to see if you can swing, or rather spin the ring around that spindle. If you can, you know that it's in there properly. If you couldn't, there'd be too much tension on it because it would be cockeyed and you wouldn't be able to do that. But that spins in there fine, so I know that that's seated correctly. And then spin the rotor to make sure that spins around properly, which it does. Put a drop of air tool oil in each of these slots. Next. And then each vane inserts in its slot. There's a gap on the top there, and that gives you plenty of room to insert the vane. While the vanes are in place, spin it to make sure that it still spins freely, and you can see along the top here how the vanes slide out of their slots. That's exactly what you want. That way we know there's not too much surface tension in there with the oil, and that the vanes are going to glide properly in and out of their slots. Next we take the end plate and the wear plate. The wear plate fits inside the end plate, and there's some cutouts here and here that accept tabs on the wear plate. Just make sure those are lined up properly. And the wear plate drops right in. These two holes on the bottom align with these two slots in the bottom of the housing. So make sure that just goes in and sets over. You're going to have to press it in to make sure it sets down all the way. And then note that the grooves on the plate have to line up with the grooves on the bottom of the rotor housing, because the body screws go through these grooves during final assembly when we're done there. So that should all line up properly, and it does. Finally, take the other bearing and press that into place around the spline drive. Make sure that sets in there perfectly. Last, take the speed selector, put a little bit of lubrication around the O-ring, and then insert that in the rear of the housing. This tab here fits into the long slot on the top of the housing. And that just presses in, just like that. Next, the whole rotor assembly goes into the body. On the bottom is this square slot here. That has to fit around this square piece in the rear of the housing. Look in the back and you'll notice that the selector sits flush with the outside of the housing. It does not protrude out. There's no gap underneath it. That is correct. That's when you know you have a back all the way. And yes, the plate's going to stick out a little bit in the front. That's normal. Be sure that all your holes are lined up. So this plate, like I mentioned before, has to line up. As long as the grooves in the plate line up with the grooves in the housing, then you've got that as it needs to be. Perfect. Set that aside because it's complete. Next we do the hammer assembly. Hammer cage, anvil, 2 hammers, 2 pins, and the hammer housing. We're going to insert the hammers into the hammer cage. These have to go a particular way. If you look at the little ghost with their hands in the air, turn one of them upside down so that his hands are facing down, the others are facing up. Also, note these 2 narrow grooves on one end and these 2 wider grooves on the other end. When you flip one of these over, you're now lining up one of the narrow grooves with one of the wide grooves. This is correct. And then put this in the housing so that these grooves go along the side that have the grooves to accept the pins. Like that. Take one of the pins and slide them through. The first pin always goes in pretty easy. The second pin, we're going to have to jiggle the hammers a little bit to get the grooves to line up. Once we do, that slides right in. Now don't turn this on end or the pins are going to fall out. Lubricate the surfaces of the hammers and the surface of the hammer cage, and also lubricate the dogs on the anvil. And insert the anvil into the hammer assembly. You have to jiggle it a little bit to get the dogs past the hammers. When the anvil sits flush like that, it's correct. Once that's lubricated, insert this entire assembly into the housing. That just slides right in. The anvil sticks out the front. And you're perfect. Now I put the new gasket on. There's a tab on here that goes into a groove on the bottom of the hammer housing. So that has to sit in there like so. It might be easier for you to put this on the hammer house, the rotor housing first. Just make sure you have it lined up properly, that now that tab goes toward the trigger and it sticks up so that the groove in the housing fits over that. Whichever way you want to do it's fine. Just make sure you don't get it misaligned or the screws will not insert properly, and double check all your holes to make sure that they're correct, and they seem to be just fine. So we mate the hammer assembly with the rotor assembly, making sure that the tab here is going to fit into, rather the groove here is going to fit into the tab on that gasket. Just line your splines up on the rotor to the splines on the hammer assembly and make sure that that fits in there nice and tight with no gaps. A little bit of Loctite goes on each body screw. Slide it gently in place and make sure that it goes in its hole. Don't tighten the screws just yet. Just make sure the thread on the hole's okay, because if you have something misaligned, then the screws aren't going to go in correctly. So just do that first. Make sure everything feeds threads correctly, and then you can go ahead and tighten everything down. And I have something misaligned. See how the corner of the hammer housing does not line up with the body housing? I'm glad this happened, because now I can show you what to do. All right, here's what I screwed up. Notice how the grooves in the plate no longer line up with the grooves in the housing. I clearly misoriented this plate somehow. This is why you don't want to go and over tightening your screws, because if I had something wrong and I started forcing stuff, then I'd break something, I'd strip a screw, or I'd wreck a thread in the housing or something like that. So always make sure you go slow and carefully until you're sure you got everything right. Just to make sure I get everything right, I'm going to remove the whole assembly, because it's important to make sure I got the plate oriented correctly on the housing here. And I think I mentioned before how the holes in the bottom of the wear plate have to line up with the holes in the bottom of the assembly, and they do. And these tabs have to line up with the tabs in the housing here, and they do. So I'm confident that I have that correct. I'm just going to eyeball the alignment now. It looks right, so we're going to put this back in. To make everything a little easier, I'm taking the plate off just so I can grab onto that spline. I don't know why I had that misaligned, but I want to make it as easy on myself as possible to make sure I manipulate everything correctly. All right, now that the rotor housing's back in, put the plates back on, and here's where I want to double check my hole alignment. Those look correct. The gasket on with the tab facing up along the bottom. And check my hole alignment again. Looks correct. Drop the hammer assembly on. That looks correct. And then put the rotor housing back on. We'll try it again with the screws. Now, I'm just going to tighten these down a little bit just to make sure all the threads line up properly and those screws go in the way they should. Double check that my gasket appears to be good with no pinches or gaps. Now I can start tightening these screws sequentially and progressively. Because there's a gasket involved, I don't want to just tighten one corner at a time all the way. I want to go in a cross pattern to evenly apply pressure to this gasket so it won't pinch it. Now you can follow me out to the garage where we'll put this on the compressor to give it a test. It screams right along just like I wanted. I'll give it back to my customer this week where he's going to put it to the test in the shop to make sure it's working exactly as he's expecting at full power. I'm glad you had a chance to watch me go through the question about aligning the holes on this, because those little problems are the ones that are going to have you pulling your hair out unless you know what to look for. Keep watching the channel, because in addition to this repair, we've got a 3/4 Mako air impact repair video coming out, as well as a new flyer drop video that'll take us through the end of the year, and of course our regular tools in the haul segments. This one is going to have some special after dark items that I know you're going to want to see, especially because one of them has a very special story. So do me a favor and click down here now to subscribe so you don't miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, use a tool. Don't be one.